So as a real estate photographer, one of the most important pieces of gear that you need no matter what is a tripod. You can get sharp and level image, HDR photography, flash, make sure your composition is perfect. It's just the foundation of how you do photos in this industry. So I recently went to do a listing where I actually forgot my tripod. It's honestly the first time I've done that in 5, 6, 7 years that I've been doing this. The way I looked at it is I could basically have to reschedule and really inconvenience the realtor, go buy a tripod, possibly miss my window, spend money doing that, or make do without one and try and make it work. So I ended up doing my same HDR method, but handheld. And honestly, the results are practically the same. So let's break down how you can do this if you're ever in this similar situation or if you're just wanting to try out something new. So let's get into the video right now. Okay, so let's break down the overview of this process. So essentially, we're replacing a tripod with our arms and hands. The whole idea is to not just be like, let's get crazy looking shots, freeform, whatever. Like, the idea is just simply like, we're gonna use our arms and hands to replace the tripod. We're still gonna be at the same height, chest level. We're gonna keep the verticals in our shot straight. So using an in-camera leveler is super important. So we're essentially just becoming the tripod. And if you think about it that way, like what shot should I get if I had a tripod? So if I had a tripod, I would probably have my camera right here. I'd be in the corner of the room. Do those same shots, because if you try and think about it differently, now that you're not using a tripod and you're gonna try weird shots, you might not like the results you get, and they might not look really professional. So let's dive into camera settings. It's basically the same camera settings you would use as if you're using a tripod, but we're gonna tweak a couple things. But let's start there. So for me, these are my settings. I start with an ISO of 400, my shutter speed at 1/15, aperture at f8. Those are pretty much the settings across the board I always start out with and then go tweak from there. So even though we're using RAW, I always try and get the most accurate white balance in camera. Like I just want the photo to be as perfect as I can get it in camera to make editing easier. So I always start at 4800 and then adjust from there. That way it just makes it a lot easier in editing for me. So next we're gonna enable auto exposure bracketing. So what that does is it takes a series of photos at different exposures. And because we're doing handheld, I had it set for just 3 exposures. So at -2, 0, +2. And I know it might be called something different in other cameras, like I'm using a Canon R6, but I recently was training my friend who uses a Lumix, I think a Lumix S5. And we had to dive through his menu system and we found that, but it was just called something different. So you just have to find out where that is in your menu system. Now, the great thing about using this setting versus doing it manually is it does the shutter compensation for you. So if we do 3 brackets like this, it's gonna be one for the shadows, midtones, and the highlights. That way we pretty much have it all covered. So the biggest thing to look for now that we have our settings is how slow can you go on that overexposed shot. So if we do this -2, 0, +2, that +2 shot is gonna be really overexposed for the shadows. You have to make sure that that shutter speed for that photo is able to be handheld. Like it's not too slow and it's gonna get motion blur. Like if that photo, that last photo is like a second long, it's gonna be blurry. So you have to kind of test it out and see where your settings can be at to make sure that that's fast enough to hold. So a good rule of thumb is, for example, I'm using a 15-35, so 15mm full frame. I don't want my shutter speed to be slower than 1/15 of a second. Slower than that could result in a blurry, not sharp image. And if you want to be safe, you can double that. So if you're using a 16mm lens, do at least 1/30 of a second. Now, the great thing about mirrorless and tech and cameras evolving is you can break that rule if you have stabilization, in-camera stabilization, and with my Canon R6, paired with a 15-35, I can actually go really slow. I've tested it before and I can actually handhold like half a second and it's a tack sharp image. It's pretty crazy. It's like I'm using a tripod, but I didn't go that slow. I didn't have to. I think my slowest shutter was 1/8 of a second. So definitely if you don't have any sort of stabilization in your camera or lens, I would say first double your shutter on that overexposed shot to be safe. Now the only problem with that is you might have to compensate by bumping your ISO. Since we don't have the flexibility of going really slow on a tripod, you might have to bump your ISO really high, resulting in a really noisy image. I went all the way up to 3200 in some of these rooms because they were darker, but with the Canon R6, really good at low light, not a problem at all. So definitely make sure you know these things in advance before your shoot. If you're gonna do that, test this out, or if you're on location on an actual listing before you go through the whole house. Test these settings out, see, you know, what's a comfortable ISO to stick at, whether it's like 1600 or how slow you can go, and go from there. So now let's go through some best practices to get the best result. Now that we know what we're doing, you know, the overview of this concept, camera settings, let's actually get into the shooting part of it. So first thing you want to do whenever you're about to get set up in your shot is you want to lock your arms and hold the camera like this. I'll turn to the side of it so you can see better. You want to go like this and lock your arms. You don't basically want to be like this, or I don't think it would be a good idea to also do it through the viewfinder because it's going to be really high. You know, you want your photos to typically be around chest level. That's a really good perspective. And if you go too high, like at the eyepiece standing up straight, you know, depending on how tall you are, it might be way too much ceiling, not so much floor, giving you a really unbalanced image. Luckily, my camera has a flip screen so I can look down, see the whole image, make sure my shot is level. And then the last thing you want to do is make sure you have your 2-second timer. That way, when you click that shutter, there's going to be no delay and it's going to go through the bracketed sequence on its own versus having to do it each time, making sure your shots line up pretty good. And that's it. The rest is just up to composition. Like I said, stick to where you think your tripod would be. Single point perspectives, keep them simple, and just get the best resulting image that way. Okay, so now let's quickly mention some pros and cons. So pros, first off, it's faster. You don't have to set up a tripod, move your legs, make sure your height is right. You know, sometimes I have to unlock the legs, bring it lower, higher. It's already faster because the camera's in your hand. You can compose, walk from spot to spot. You'll just get through the home a lot faster. Especially this one was a 2-story home, which I think around 3,000 square feet, and I was done in like 25 minutes. Second, you can get wider, nicer compositions. You know, again, having the restraint of a tripod where you can only have it a certain distance from the corner of the room because the way the legs extend, you can sometimes get wider shots or nicer perspectives that you might miss if you're using a tripod due to whatever limitations are in the room. Sometimes, like I just mentioned, there's stuff in the corner of the room, so you can't put your tripod there, whether there's a plant, a table, or furniture. Not being able to put your tripod there might result in a worse angle. So having that freedom and flexibility, especially being able to get super in that corner to give you a wider shot from corner to corner, is pretty nice. So first major drawback, you might mess up on your camera settings and get blurry images. They might not be usable and you might have to do a reshoot, not use the bracketed shot. There's a lot of room for error if you don't know what you're doing. So I really stress that you try this out beforehand because it just might not be for you, whether it's your camera setup, your equipment, things that you're using. And lastly, you might possibly get worse compositions. One thing I noticed, it's really easy to overthink what camera angle, what perspective to put it at because you don't have your tripod and you're just like, oh, I'll go here or I'll go here. But it really helped me, like I mentioned before, if I just pretended like, okay, my tripod would be here, so I'm just gonna stick to this angle. Chest level, arms locked, doorway perspective, corner to corner, or single perspective head-on shot, and that gave me pretty much the same results. So final thoughts, it's honestly a great fallback to do this technique if you forget your tripod or you're in a situation where you can just, you know you can do this and get away with it. I want to stress that using a tripod is still the best way to go about it. You'll learn about composition more, frame up your shots better, but if you're ever in a similar situation, you could get away with it. Also, this works great for exterior shots because you can have your shutter speed really high because it's so bright outside. So I do that all the time if I really need to get a more dynamic image versus just doing a single shot exposure outside. So that's pretty much it, guys. I wanted to make this video because I can't believe I ran into this situation and I was honestly so surprised with the results. And I was like, hey, I got to share this with you guys because this would be really valuable. And like I said, it's a great fallback or possibly another technique to try out. So leave a like if you enjoyed, comment down your thoughts, subscribe if you haven't already. I would love for you guys to be part of the channel. And I'll see you guys in the next video. See ya. Daughter is up now, just in time.